This is the Fire These Times, and I'm your host, Ayoub. In this third season, we will be exploring internationalist solidarity, prefigurative politics, solarpunk, and how to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our times. Each episode will be on one or more of these topics. But before getting into today's topic, I wanted to quickly tell you that you can support this podcast for as little as $2 or $5 a month on patreon.com/firethesetimes. That is patreon.com/firethesetimes. If you cannot donate, you can still support by sharing it with your friends and families and leaving a review wherever you listen to podcasts. This helps it get more exposure and introduce it to more folks. That's it from me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
So I'm Kavita Krishnan, and I'm a Marxist feminist activist in India. For 30 years, I belonged to the Communist Party of India, Marxist-Leninist. And recently, I've had a break with that a few months ago. And Ukraine was the catalyst in that break. And I'll talk about that more, presumably, in the interview.
Yeah, I'm Promise Lee, originally from Hong Kong. I live in Los Angeles now in the US. Yeah, I'm involved in various movements, but I think, more recently part of a Hong Kong diaspora left-wing group called Lausan Collective, and engaged in various international solidarity work with movements in Hong Kong and also China occasionally, and I'm part of other groups, especially socialist groups in the US like Solidarity and more recently Tempest Collective, and also do some tenant organizing in Chinatown in Los Angeles, and been in various other movement spaces as well. And I'll just leave it at that for now.
I'm Romeo. I'm the managing editor of the New Voice of Ukraine, one of Ukraine's only English language newspapers. I've been a Marxist since I was 12 years old, and I've managed to kind of claw my way up the traditional media ladder. I also host a podcast called Ukraine Without Hype, which comes out around every 2 weeks, and we discuss the biggest headlines of the week in Ukraine in English.
The thing that kind of brings us all together, and we should say before kind of really starting that Romeo is obviously in Ukraine, so there might be some power outages. If there is, we'll just adapt, and hopefully there won't be. I had written a piece, it feels like a century ago, but I think it was only 2 years ago, called The Periphery Has No Binaries, and for Lausan Collective, actually. And long story short, I won't get into it too much, but the main argument I was making is that what we can call multipolarity, I wasn't really thinking of that term back then, it kind of feels like a luxury that a lot of folks, usually in some of the imperial cores, often in the West, but not just, as we'll get into it here, or who think, let's put it that way, who think in those binaries, as we would call them, campism, i.e., America equal imperialism, everything else not. Let's get into it a bit more. And for those who don't know, obviously, what is multipolarity? What is this thing that we're even talking about? It sounds quite fancy, but why is it a thing? Why is it a thing that still exists as a concept that folks are actually, especially on the left, of course, are actually willing to defend? And why are we challenging that? And we don't quite have an order of how to talk, so we can just be civilized. So you just raise your hand, or you don't have to do that even. Just go for it, talk. If anyone interrupts anyone, we can just adapt from that. It's fine. So I don't know who wants to go first on that, because I think everyone has something to say.
I'll go ahead and go first, since everyone seems to be a little shy. So this, I think it's best to start with a handy definition of multipolarity. So the way it's most commonly used is an evolution of the kind of bipolar or kind of even unipolar world, where the United States, initially the United States and the Soviet Union were the two global hegemons. They were the two global superpowers. After the fall of the Soviet Union, of course, that left just the United States. But due to a combination of both the inexorable march of history and some poor mistakes by the U.S. government. The U.S. state has seemingly lost some of this only or unipolar hegemonic status in the world, especially following the disastrous and immoral war on terror. As a result, other powers, notably China, and Russia, of course, likes to consider itself part of this, began gaining some of the prominence that the U.S. once solely held. And this is the concept we call multipolarity, or rather, a world defined by multiple imperial cores instead of just one. One of the things that I like to point out as soon as anyone launches into a defense of multipolarity, after all, isn't it better to have multiple competing interests instead of one? Well, the thing is, they're still imperial cores. We're still talking about countries that want to be empires or that are empires currently, exerting influence on their neighbors and on their surroundings and on the globe as a whole. And when you break up that hegemonic control into several different parts, it just makes it that much harder to organize around and tackle, because suddenly these different poles can co-opt resistance. And this is what we see very often with especially left-wing defenses of multipolarity, is that these separate imperial cores, not American imperial cores, can co-opt resistance to American imperialism and promote imperialism, simply not U.S.-centric. So in a nutshell, that's the base concept of multipolarity here that we'll be discussing.
Yeah, I'll just briefly add, I think Romeo gave a really great summary of what multipolarity is, and start us off with a good argument, right? I think one thing that's important to kind of note, right, is that for multipolarity, or for how is that this faith in multipolarity rests on this understanding of how imperialism works globally, right? I think a lot of folks feel that imperialism is mainly invested in the U.S. and the West as these geopolitical actors that exert influence over these other countries, and completely ignoring the fact that global finance exists, right? International monetary and financial other economic organs exist, and we live actually in a world in which more and more nation states are being recruited as part of this kind of deepening phase of neoliberalism, right? In which more and more things are being privatized, neoliberalized. And this, and I'll say more, I guess, about this throughout the course of the podcast, is that we're actually seeing, and I think there was a lot of research, and especially what some were calling new state capitalism studies, right? And kind of Marxist political economy and other adjacent discourses, where we're looking actually at, mid-sized and regional actors, right? Let's leave out China for now, right? Even talk about Brazil, South Africa, right? All these other nation states that are, not easily aligned to all these different powers, or traditionally in the last decade or so considered part of the BRICS bloc, right? Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, etc., as a seemingly kind of alternate power economic political bloc, right, to the U.S. and the West. But that's completely false, right? I think that's becoming more and more obvious that a lot of these states are being recruited and not, as victims, right, of the IMF-led world order, but the national ruling elites for a lot of these countries, especially in the global South, right, are actually working completely in hand with the Western capitalist ruling class, right, and complicit in increasingly new ways to exploit the working class and other marginalized populations of the global South. And I think our task, right, as socialists, anarchists, leftists, progressives, is to actually unearth and find these interconnections between nation states, right, between different capitalist ruling classes, to see how they're finding new ways to exploit their own workers, right? And I feel like that's completely what's missing when we, place our faith in multipolarity, because by placing faith in multipolarity as it exists today, we're really only placing faith on a certain, new permutation of how global capitalism works, right? And I guess I'll just stop there for now. and maybe pass it to Kavita.
So I think after the really excellent introductions to the explanations of what the concept of multipolarity has meant all this while, what I'd like to add is some observations about the way in which that term now has taken on meanings that are not widely acknowledged at all. In fact, I would say that these are the dominant ways in which this term is now used. So I have been observing for some time that in Mr. Putin's and Xi Jinping's articulation, and on seeing that even the articulations of the Modi regime in India and various other sort of far-right and authoritarian forces, multipolarity has meant, okay, they say that, we want a multipolar world, not a unipolar world. All right. What do they mean by that? They say that the universal standards or widely accepted standards of democracy and human rights are a Western imposition, that these are the unipolar sort of imperialist imposition. And so the fight for sovereignty and for anti-imperialism means a rejection of these universal standards. It basically means that every big power, and mind you, this doesn't mean, this doesn't apply to small countries, it applies to poles. So it doesn't apply to, sections of people or nationalities or anything. It applies to the big powers. And it's to big powers and aspiring big powers, what they're saying is, you get to do what you please, and no one has the right to question you. You can define democracy as good governance. You can define democracy as majoritarianism. You can define human rights as, happiness. You can do what you like. And basically, no one should have the right to question you. I'll speak more about that later, but I think that I just wanted to say that, for the left, I think the idea of this polarity, this should have always been an alien discourse, because this springs from realism, from the Kissinger school, so I cannot understand when and how this became a part of left language. Now the fact that the left uses this language, completely shutting its ears to the fact that it has acquired a very dangerous meaning, is something really alarming to me.
And if I can just jump off of that, one of the things that I've noticed with this talk of multipolarity is what the states mean, Kavita, as you said, is basically they want to be able to do whatever they want and they don't want anyone to criticize them, right? And at the end of the day, that's what these states mean when they use this term. But I've noticed in discourse, this gets melded into somehow rejecting Western influence or pushing back against U.S. liberal capitalist values, which, again, as you know, Kavita, completely destroys the universality of the values that we presumably all hold and are trying to build a world that represents it. And I think that melding, that confusion of, well, we have to reject everything that the United States does, and we want to commit atrocities against our populations without hearing people complain about it. I think these two things get confused to the point where I've seen multiple times people argue that human rights are not a leftist value or shouldn't be part of the conversation when we're talking about building a progressive world, because this is a Western concept, which again is ridiculous. As far as I understood, human rights apply to humans and not a particular nationality or ethnic group. But because of this confusion and its use and its promulgation by very well-known fascists like Alexander Dugin in Russia, has become, I think, one of the scarier trends in the left in the past 10 years.
Would we argue that confusion is a huge factor, if not maybe the main factor with all of this, because I guess the main tension here, one of the main tensions that to various extents we've all noticed, either online or in real life or whatever, is a lot of folks who would be otherwise progressive, defending reproductive rights, LGBTQ rights, even maybe open borders, they would have different progressive values. They would defend at home, quote unquote, in the US, in India, in Europe, whatever. But as soon as you cross the border, so to speak, or you go to a certain part of the world that gets filtered through this binary, right, the campus binary, if that's the right term for it here, well, they essentially adopt conservative politics, even far-right politics at times. It can get very, and I'm using the word schizophrenic. Obviously, this is not the accurate terms of it, but in popular parlance, this is how it can be understood. It can feel quite contradictory, right? Let's stick to that. Why do you think that is? Or at least in your experience, at the very least, why do you think folks in your own contexts still adopt those binaries if they can't intellectually defend them, assuming that everyone does so?
I'll say briefly that I think in my experience, especially organizing in the US, right, I think there's this kind of sense of guilt, right? Being in the imperial core, being white, being American, whatever you call it, actually ends up overshadowed. So actually, their kind of international analysis ends up being foreshadowed by this kind of politics of guilt and not actually grounded on listening to voices on the ground, right? And beyond that, actually having a clear assessment of political economy, of how power works in the international global arena. Because, of this urge to want to center this fact that, people of the global south can govern themselves. And somehow this has turned into this kind of faith and frankly, uncritical allegiance to these governments and identifying these governments with the people. I think another discourse I've heard, right, in recent years is that, we can't call certain states or states in the global south authoritarian, even where they're clearly authoritarian, right? Because these are racist code words, things like that. And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon where leftists, especially in the West, refuse to understand and refuse to see critical minorities, right? Especially leftists, their counterparts in these regions, who are actually doing the work to call these regimes out and to label these regimes for what they are, and refusing to kind of acknowledge that, right? And to place what they see as racist or what they see as a position from the West over the voices of actual communists, Marxists and other leftists on the ground. And I think the authoritarianism charge, and I think one thing that I tried kind of touching on in my piece in Spectre is that what we see today, I mean, indeed, I think the U.S. definitely weaponizes the discourse of authoritarianism, right? Orientalizing states like China and other countries of global South, as if the U.S. is some sort of perfect or imperfect democracy, liberal democracy, over the values of these crude authoritarianisms, which is obviously false, right? And I think, but actually the way to kind of address this binary is not to simply side with the other part of this puzzle, right? But it's actually looking at the facts, and I tried to delve a little bit more into this in the piece, is that there's that uneven rise in authoritarianisms, right? And I think it's important to talk about authoritarianism and its unevenness, especially in the last couple of years, right? Because I think, to me, we can't reduce the rise of something like Trump, right, in imperfect liberal democracies to the phenomenon of Xi Jinping, Putin, and etc. Right? Bolsonaro is not the same as Trump, and Trump is not the same as Xi Jinping. And this might seem like semantics, or I'm going into kind of arguing over wordings, but I do think this is really important from a movement perspective, right? I don't think a lot of people in the West understand that it's nearly impossible, right, to build independent organizations at all, right, to fight on any arena of civil society in a public and open way when you get to countries like China, Russia, right, even Egypt, etc. And I think that's markedly different from the arena of struggle we have in the U.S. and in certain European countries in the West, etc. And that is not to say that, there are countries in the West that are somehow better politically than some of these other ones, but to recognize, the actually existing phenomenon of authoritarianism is diverse. It's uneven. It produces different kinds of far right movements, right, and regimes that require different tactics, right, different analyses. And there's no one size fit all model in terms of how we can address these different authoritarian actors. This is the real conversation we should be having, right? And with the discourse of multipolarity, it actually prevents us from adequately understanding, right, our political conditions in order to fight back capitalist authoritarian forces, because, a lot of leftists have chosen one side of the binary as opposed to actually understand the fact that, authoritarianism is manifesting itself in different forms, right? And that requires different kinds of movements, right? Different kind of pluralistic movements in order to fight off these different threats. And that should be the starting point of conversation. And, I think a lot of the left, especially in the West, are not even there, right? And I think that's part of the problem when we center multipolarity as opposed to centering, different and very diverse movements, right, that are resisting different state actors on their own right.
I can quickly add, if that's okay. I'm just wondering, we're talking with someone from Hong Kong and someone from Ukraine. So I sort of feel it's almost cruel to explore that, but this is what we see. We see this quite often. And yes, I mostly work in English and French, and Arabic, so I mostly see it around here, quote unquote, in this part of the world. In the Middle East, or Middle East and North Africa, or Swana, or whatever terms you want to use, in the Arab majority world, there are certain tendencies that are very similar to this, but I feel like they come from a different position. The conclusions are sometimes the same, although they often tend to kind of veer towards helplessness, hopelessness, cynicism, maybe even apathy. So not wholeheartedly endorsing Russia, but also saying we don't have a dog in this fight or whatever. Those kinds of arguments. And I feel like they come from a very specific positionality, usually from helplessness, because most of the Arab world is simply not democratic. And even the few examples that have some kind of democracy are extremely imperfect, to put it very mildly. Lebanon, Tunisia, and so on. From your experience, and I think, Kavita, you wanted to say something anyway, but from your experience, are there some interesting differences, let's say, between the Indian left and the US left, just because I have you two on here, or the Hong Kong left, the Chinese left for that matter, and I don't know, maybe the Ukrainian left, if Romeo you wanted to entertain it that way. What are some certain, or the Russian left, given that Russia is now invading Ukraine, what are certain interesting similarities or differences between those different lefts, if we want to put it that way, that you can identify? Because I feel like it can help us because if they reach the same conclusions, at least the same at the surface level, the fact that they may not have the same origins, the same motivations, may actually help us, I hope, tackle that, right? Actually deconstruct that in a way that would make it less potent than as much as we're seeing it today, if that makes sense.
One thing which I'd like to add, if that's okay, was that Promise was very sharp in explaining why in America, in the USA, there is this sort of guilt and hesitancy about the idea that we shouldn't be racist, we shouldn't say the things that our government is saying, and all of that. But I think that there is a different way in which we could look at the problem as a problem of the global left. And while there are differences in position, I think that the basic fault line, is the basic fallacy is actually something shared in common. And I'm going to try and explain that. But first, I will say that, yes, I've had to remind a lot of people who are talking about the problem, that the West is making it all about itself. The left in America is making, America's the source of evil everywhere. And so that's it, So because it's coming from guilt and all of that. But that doesn't explain why it's almost worse in the global South. And I think that, and the problem in the global South is that the left is not a tiny segment. Yes, it's a minority. It has, different levels of moderate electoral success. But in a country like India, it's still a pretty large, it has a pretty large audience compared to that in most countries of the West. So the harm these kind of attitudes do is substantial, because if you are one of the rare few consistent democratic voices in your country, then, and you sort of legitimize the idea of, these are lesser evils, Putin and Xi or whatever, and, we have to sort of pull our punches there. Okay, we are with Ukraine, but, we want Ukraine to have its sovereignty. But, both Ukraine and Russia are bleeding, and so there should be negotiations. Continuing the war only benefits America, etc. And this is the better part of the left that I'm describing. There's also the other part which openly says, oh, China and Russia's rise is excellent, rah-rah, cheerleading for those countries. So I think that the way in which I find it more useful to explain these things is that there is a problem with the left losing its moorings, in the sense that the left should have its moorings not in these, formulas, in these, macro formulas. The idea should be simple, that you support struggles against the ruling classes anywhere or against oppressors anywhere. Why is that hard? Why does it have, why would you sort of measure out how much solidarity you give where, and sort of give less solidarity against what you think of as an anti-US power? Why would you invest even the little, in the smallest, even to the smallest degree, in the survival of, oppressive regimes anywhere, of invading imperialisms anywhere? And I think what happens is that one of the key reasons why this happens is this idea, it's almost like a George Bush style, with us or against us. So the idea is, I've found in my experience here that even in good faith, the bad faith actors in India on the left are openly saying, oh, you're a CIA agent and so on and so forth. But if you, minus those, and you look at the sort of reasonably good faith people on the left, so they kind of, look very sad and regretful and say, that what happens is that if you are critical, or if you are saying that authoritarianism of the kind that you have in China, exactly what you were saying, Promise, that there is no room there isn't that kind of room for struggle and for movements. In India right now, it's hard. You get imprisoned for it, but it's still not as bad as it is in Russia or China. It's not gotten there yet. It might tomorrow. But that's exactly why we should learn from those countries about how it has gotten there and how we can prevent it from getting there in India, right? Likewise in the US. But I think what they think is that if you are criticizing these regimes, and especially China, then basically you are for liberal democracy. And if you are for liberal democracy, then you can't be on the left. You are not socialist. And I keep saying that, look, all of us in all our countries, in the struggles we wage, are fighting to achieve rights, which we would call rights in the terms of liberal democracy. All those rights they have been won by struggles. They haven't been given by some liberal regime. Many of them have been won by struggle, especially in India. Civil liberties is something the left has struggled for. And so, the idea that a socialist democracy, it's very simple, that it should be, whatever you call it, whatever you're struggling for beyond this, has to be better, more democratic than this. It cannot be that you destroy these achievements and then build socialism from anew. And I think that is where the problem comes. I don't have a simple answer, because I know that in Marxist-Leninist terms, the idea is you don't build on the old state, you destroy the old state, and then you build a new, and all of that. And I think that is where, the basic problem arises, that the idea that whatever democratic rights are won, democratic institutions are in place, the idea that somehow, the minute you have a socialist revolution, anywhere, if you do, we are very far from that in everywhere in the world right now. But if you do, as we did in, Russia or China or whatever, is that then, whatever democratic rights there are, they all have to go down. They don't count. You should not have them. Having them is bourgeois and all of that. And so, you just, create something else and call it democracy. And to me, and I'll end here, to me, it's similar to the discussion in India, for instance, which prevailed for a long time and still does on the left, which is to say that feminism is bourgeois and that we are Marxists and that's good enough, So feminism is bourgeois. And so the idea is that, well, not really. Those are terms used at a time when the left, Marxist feminism itself was a huge, nearly, it was a competing force. And then they could say, okay, bourgeois feminism and ours, right? Marxist movement. But it's not like that anymore. And the minute you say that feminism is bourgeois, what are you saying essentially? What are you going to be struggling for essentially? So I think that that's, very poorly put, but I think that there is something basic here that is flawed.
In fact, this behavior is something you can, I think, at least for me, one of the clearest examples of this kind of very strange mindset, as you pointed out, Kavita, is the support of these authoritarian regimes by people who identify as LGBT, people who are, openly trans or openly homosexual, and then they'll turn around and say, well, China is doing this, it's better than the US, their COVID policy is better, they've eliminated homelessness and so on. And it's absurd because these are people that don't have rights in most of the countries that they're praising. That the second they cross that border, there is a high chance they will be arrested if they are publicly acting in the way they act in the West. And it's like, you want to destroy your own rights? Like, how do you imagine this happening?
I'll just quickly add, Promise, and then you can go. The argument that what you mentioned, Kavita, before, the whole, feminism is bourgeois, we're Marxists and that's enough and whatnot. I definitely see resonances of that. I've experienced it in Lebanon, and I know that it's an issue in the wider Arab world, Arab majority world. Sometimes they would say stuff like, I know Palestinians, for example, Palestinian feminists have to deal with this among Palestinians. Like they say, we'll deal with women's rights after liberation from Israeli occupation. We'll deal with queer rights after that. And of course, to paraphrase one of the songs, it's called in Arabic Jasadik Home by Dam, D-A-M. The singer, the main singer, basically said at some point, when you resist Israel, you threaten their Zionism. When I resist Israel, I also threaten in Arabic, it would sound like masculinity, i.e. the patriarchy. And it's the fact that those phenomenon actually work with one another. There is a reason why strong men are men. It's not like an accident of history. Of course, we can think of like a Thatcher or whatever, but they tend to be the exceptions. They also tend to function in different ways.
Meloni.
Yeah. Meloni, exactly now. And, anyway, all of that to say that those arguments have always ended up serving the ruling class, the state, the oppressive state, and so on. And it's kind of ironic, I think, at this point. And I'm not even sure if absurd, maybe that's the term I was looking for. Like, it's really absurd at this point. And, I was thinking, Romeo, you mentioned some folks, even who are LGBTQ, would make these arguments. I remember once it was a Twitter thread of someone who was arguing that one of the few truly trans-friendly countries in the world is North Korea. And I found that incredible. I really did. And this was someone, I don't remember the name, but this was someone who's they're not even anonymous. They were like a journalist in the US or whatever it was. I have a profile and everything. And I'm just using this as an example, but these things, we've seen them. We've really seen, even in Qatar. I was baffled during the World Cup, the FIFA World Cup, that there were some folks who were actually saying that we cannot hold the same standards to judge Qatar and its treatments of migrant workers and LGBTQ rights and whatnot. And those arguments were kind of perfectly aligned with openly homophobic, transphobic, racist arguments being made by supporters of the Qatar regime who are not on the left, who would be considered on the right and whatnot. And what obviously the people who get erased, as we've said here, are like queer Qataris or migrant workers in Qatar, and all of those folks, as if they don't exist, essentially. Romeo?
All I want to say is that, in fact, the Qatari government, I believe a Qatari spokesperson, he was talking to a Western newspaper about human rights criticism of his government, and he literally said, like, his exact words were, "You cannot judge us by your Western standards. We're a different civilization." Literally the exact same thing that these people are saying, which is, to my mind, the farthest you can get from leftism as possible. That is literally a reactionary value that you're upholding, that there are these siloed civilizations of humans that are fundamentally different. This is a fascist idea. And the fact that it is repeated as some sort of progressive ideology is obscene, to be honest.
Sisi himself in Egypt has also said that, and that has made very difficult. I think it's really weakened the campaign to support all of the Egyptian political prisoners, as we've seen recently with the COP in Egypt and the calls to free Ala and everyone else. It's really made it difficult, because I feel like that argument, and it is an argument, obviously, like that argument has, I don't know if the term is hegemonic, I'm not sure, but it has become something that is kind of like it's anchored in more, like the universalism of human rights before that, with all of the flaws of universalism and whatever, like has receded somewhat, I feel. And I can't help but feel like, or think that in one way or another, this is also a way in which neoliberal thinking, atomization has sort of been internalized and reified in quote unquote our spaces.
Yeah, I just want to briefly put on what you said. I think, carrying on this discussion, right, this relationship between the left and, these, other progressive movements of marginalized identities, or LGBTQ movement, feminist movements, student movements, etc. And also this notion of socialist democracy, right, which I think is a term that should just be more discussed, right? Not social democracy, but revolutionary socialist democracy, right? What does it mean to imagine socialism as a political system of a kind of governance, right? That isn't actually about a one-party system, right? Isn't about, one enlightened, vanguard, thrusting its ideals upon other and putting its mold in other movements, but actually a socialist organization, socialist movement that respects the autonomy, right, of different marginalized struggles, right? And I think that's really interesting, right? Because I think going back to, what Kavita was saying about how we're actually not, our goal here shouldn't be to abandon, right, at least some of the few and important advances, right, of bourgeois democracy. It's actually to extend and maximize, right, these protections that are guaranteed under it, right, or not guaranteed, or the fact that bourgeois democracy actually doesn't guarantee these democratic freedoms, right? We need socialist democracy and actually guarantee these freedoms. And I think this is actually really interesting for me to contrast, to bring it back to multipolarity, with the fact that the adherents of left-wing multipolarity, accuse us of being, bourgeois liberals and things like that. But in reality, their theoretical framework is actually banking on capitalism, right? Let's face it, right? Multipolarity is just capitalism, right? It's different. It's capitalism by different states. And to them, they think they can use the same logic that I just said. But to them, it's like, well, okay, these national capitalisms are the good things, right, from bourgeois democracies. And these things are what we should be defending, right? Which is a completely perverse logic to me, because you're not actually defending the best of or the good things that came of bourgeois democracy. You're actually taking a step backwards, right? And going, you're defending almost like vestiges of feudalism, of fascism, of these kind of perversity that comes, especially as we enter late capitalism. And so I think it's just like a completely undialectical view of what we actually should be extending, right? And what we should be focusing on as we think about the development of history, right? That, and going back to my earlier point, right? I think what's important is, people, Western leftists, an ability to see and to recognize the autonomy of marginalized struggles that don't neatly fit in the mold of national governance, right? Of state-centered governance in these capitalist regimes. Because for them, the agency of people of the global South can only, for some reason in their heads, right, be centered on capitalist governance, right, and embodied in the form of a nation state. While in reality, there are all these different struggles going on that socialists in the global South should be also learning more about, right, how to relate to these movements, how to learn from them. And, I think, I just want to kind of touch on that talking point from these capitalists, right, that I've heard a lot is that, by criticizing the governance of global South regimes, we're actually saying that people of the global South can't run a country on their own. But why is governance, why is running a political system reduced to that specific mode, right, of politics, right? Why isn't mutual aid on the ground a type of governance, a type of, actual self-autonomy, self-activity of existing people on the ground, right? Why isn't LGBTQ movements advocating for reforms, creating safe spaces, right, for their own student movements, feminist movements? They're actually challenging state power and these own rights. Why aren't these seen as rigorous, literal systems of governance, of ways of living? And why is that kind of privilege, so to speak, only reserved to capitalist elites, ruling classes of these nation states? That in reality, should be the locus of struggle, of which movements should be struggling against, right? I firmly believe that, as a socialist Marxist, like whenever the revolution comes or something, movements must continue, right? Movements beyond the party, beyond any mass party or socialist organization must continue as a counterweight, right, to whatever, post-revolutionary system can come to exist. And I think, these are things that are completely not addressed or not centered when we center or focus on the rubric of multipolarity over learning from the existing struggles of people on the ground.
I think that, that's so, I found it really useful to think about, this assumption on the part of the left, especially, or progressive people in the North, in the West, to think that we can't hold, the countries of the global South or other kind of, nations to the same standards, and that is somehow anti-racism. As someone who is part of struggles in the global South, I've been arguing for some time that it's in fact racist to not take us seriously, those people in these countries who want democracy, who want rights, who are fighting against authoritarian tendencies. And I'll give you one example which has riled me a lot in recent years. The ambassador to India of all countries, Germany. Okay, he was in Delhi, and he decided. He's no longer the ambassador; he was the guy before this one. So he made a visit to the national headquarters in Nagpur of the main fascist organization here, the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, the RSS. The SS in that is not coincidental. This is an organization set up in the 1920s, quite directly inspired by the fascist movements in Europe of the 1920s and 30s. So, and this is not hidden because their foundational leaders said so. They said we need to do with Muslims in India what Germany has done with its Jews and all of that, with its Semitic people. So the point is, he visited the office of this, and that wasn't just it. He was photographed sort of, paying homage to, bowing down to, offering flowers to a statue of one of these founders, the guy who's actually said Hitler's a good guy and we need to be like him. Okay. So I found this so appalling. And when he was questioned on that, his answer was very telling. He said, RSS, this organization, is part of the mosaic that is India. Okay. And so, I just went there to sort of understand. It's part of the mosaic of India. What does that say? That is an Orientalist understanding that this is mosaic. Are you going to say the KKK is part of the mosaic of America? Would you say that, some new, a neo-Nazi kind of outfit anywhere? Would you go around, visiting a neo-Nazi outfit in Germany and offering flowers there or shaking hands there even and saying it's part of the mosaic of Germany? You wouldn't. You are willing to say that in India because you are looking at India as some kind of cultural space that is above politics, that is civilizational and therefore cannot be the same as our countries. That's racism. That's not anti-racism, the other thing I just wanted to say is that when the left does this, my example shows that it's not just the left that does this, right? But when the left does it, when the left sort of, thinks in the same way as the ambassador of Germany, what does that say? That says that basically, what the left ends up doing often is to equate, is to look at the states rather than as the people. So you're almost saying that the state equals people in various circumstances. So you're not making that distinction between a state and between what its people are struggling for. And I see that example most clearly, for instance, in Ukraine, where the left, if you speak about Ukraine, they will say, Zelensky is this and that. He is bringing neoliberal policies there and so on. He's selling Ukraine at Wall Street and so on. And I have two responses to that. The first I'm saying is that, of course, Zelensky is the elected, he represents the government, an elected leader. And then there are people, who are not the same as a government, first. But second, and equally important, I think, is that, it's up to the people of Ukraine to decide what struggles they're going to prioritize when, right? What Zelensky is doing in the economy is nothing exceptional. It's what the government of India is doing. It's what so many governments all over the world are doing. And I'm sure there are critics of it in Ukraine. But, the workers of Ukraine may be fighting against, draconian labor laws now or the withdrawal of labor laws now. But they are also going to be the same workers fighting in, maybe the Ukrainian army against an invasion. If the country survives, then, of course, there'll be room for all these other struggles. So I find it really strange when the left starts, doing this kind of flattening out. Because that also, I think, is exactly what the left should have been struggling against, because the left is usually a smaller tendency in a country. And if your government has to be equated with you, where are you going to stand then? You want people to be listening to you, to be listening to others in the struggle, rather than taking the word of your government for what you represent, right?
That's exactly right. And it is racist. As a Ukrainian, and I'm not even talking about being subjected to, all the Ukrainians are Nazis. But it is this dismissal of the experience of Ukrainian leftists that we agree with the liberal, democratic, the bourgeois EUification of our country, that everyone's on board, everyone in Ukraine wants the same thing. That's obviously that's false. Obviously that's false. Anyone who's ever met a single other human in their life should know that you put 3 humans in a room and you'll get 10 opinions. Humans we are a naturally quarreling and bickering bunch. And in Ukraine, that is exactly, there was an op-ed I published just the other day about Ukraine's particular love of bickering. We will argue and bicker over things that we even agree on. And especially when it comes to Zelensky's economic politics, the only reason you don't see more pushback, and part of the reason why this is going on, is because we are in a war. And in fact, I have many comrades who are currently fighting on the front lines in Bakhmut, in Soledar, and the reason they're doing that instead of protesting labor law is because if the country does not exist, all of these arguments would be not Russia wants to genocide us. They want to kill us all. So it is kind of not really the priority right now to go out and protest against the reduction in labor protections that we've been afforded, because we're currently trying to avoid being genocided. People who are dead cannot argue for their rights, as authoritarians around the world have learned, which is why they like to use genocide so often. So this is absolutely something I've been subjected to is this belief that, or this kind of shorthand of a nation state for the people that live in it. And as you said, Kavita, it is incomprehensible because a large part, most of the progress that we've made as a left have been via non-state resistance to government policy, especially in the United States. That's the majority of labor rights. That's the majority of LGBT rights. All of that has specifically been won by non-state, non-government movements explicitly resisting what the state is trying to do. And when you remove the intellectual space for that to occur, you are pretty much consigning entire swaths of people as unworthy of the rights you hold. And this is, and mostly this is true for Western leftists. It's basically saying, oh, you're Indian, you're Chinese, you're Palestinian, you just don't deserve the same rights we have. Have fun living under your authoritarian overlords and be happy about it. Be grateful that you have your authoritarian overlords, because the downside is you could be occupied by the U.S., despite the fact that, well, repression is repression regardless of whose boot is on your neck.
A couple of things I wanted to add. So I think when we're talking about the fetishization of the state, one of the things that often ends up happening is dividing the world. Like, I literally think of it as, you know, that board game Risk, like dividing the world into spheres of influence. And that term has been used by folks on the left. I'm spacing out on a few names now, but like some British leftists, for example, have literally said that like we in the contest between America and Russia in Ukraine, which is how they would frame it, we have to be sensitive to Russian demands or Russia's historical association with Ukraine, or, you know, whatever, Russia's sphere of influence, right? And obviously what that does, I mean, I think we've all said it in one way or another, but what that does is that it literally says that someone from Hong Kong who identifies as a Hong Konger cannot be, you know, cannot have that identity. This is an identity that doesn't fit our worldview, and therefore it cannot exist. Ukrainian to some extent as well. And I find that quite, as I said, I think it comes from a very realpolitik, very conservative, even isolationist to some extent worldview. It's like, you know, socialism for me, fascism for you, or like democracy for me, fascism for you, or what have you. And it's bizarre. It's really bizarre. Like, I'm thinking this is a bit facetious and a bit ridiculous, but I was watching yesterday an episode of Seinfeld, and at some point they were playing Risk. Just that's why I thought of Risk. And actually, in that episode, the Ukraine, as they would call it back then, was brought up, and Kramer said, you know, the Ukraine is weak. And then there was a Ukrainian on the train in a very stereotypically Slavic way, as they would portray them in Hollywood, basically destroys his Risk board, which I found actually quite metaphorically funny given what's happening now. But it's a thing, like, it's a tendency that's very common. And, you know, you go back 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, is it still a hiccup from the Cold War? Like, is it just a reification, a recycling essentially of that sort of binary, but instead of 2 we now have 4 or 5 or 6? Or is there something else happening? Because I think let me phrase it this way, is there any class analysis in that sort of framework? And if there isn't class analysis, what makes it left? I don't think class is the only thing. I'm against class reductionism. You know, we should be intersectional and whatnot. But if there isn't class, what does that make that?
I think one, as a direct response to that, I think one argument, just to go through a few arguments from, you know, so to speak, right, the best of the good faith, or as good faith as possible, defenders of multipolarity have heard, is that, no, it's not that socialism or whatever, conditioned socialism is somehow kind of crystallized in these nation states. It's that by, I'm just rehearsing the argument here, that having more nation states collide with each other and not just having US as a single dominant power opens up the conditions for revolutionary struggle more, right? Because then all these different imperialists will have less power, and so there's actually more room for progressive movements to come up, right? And I think, Romeo, your kind of first thing already, you know, is already, you know, clearly attacking through the logic of some of this, right? And, you know, the other ridiculous thing I've heard is that they justify this logic by saying, like, look at all these decolonization movements after the World War II. Like, World War II, because of all these imperialist clash movies, trying to open up space for these decolonization, anti-colonial movements to emerge. Like, did you forget about the World War II? Do you not understand what happened in those wars? Like, I think there were movements, yes, class-based workers' movements that took advantage of what they can, right, in order to restore and try to promote anti-colonial change. But it's completely ridiculous, right, to say that we should be calling for the conditions of something like World War II again, so that, right, it could somehow unlock the potential for decolonization. No, we should, as leftists, we emphasize, right, we stand behind decolonization, anti-colonial movements, not to call for a multipolar world in order to somehow unlock those struggles, right? That's purely, going back to, I think, what Kavita was saying, a world of formulas and dogmas, right? That actually leads us further into destruction rather than somehow unlocking space for these movements. And, another thing, I'm going to flag this example just because this is recently in the news, right? Lula's victory in Brazil, right? Lula is another person who was, really flagging this whole multipolar thing. Obviously, yeah, the PT beating Bolsonaro is good. Like, that's great. I'm glad Bolsonaro didn't win, right? I'm sure there are a lot of progressive reforms under Lula's regime, of course, and his past regime, not so much, right? And we'll have yet to see, what type of administration he'll have with his, very broad coalition. But that's all to say, what's happening in Brazil, the victories in Brazil, whatever, Chile, whatever you can call it, does not automatically translate to what's happening in movements in China, right? In Iran, right? In Russia, where the anti-war feminist movements, workers' movements are being crushed, right? And when we talk about multipolarity, we can't just be like, well, look at Lula, look at Brazil, right? Literally the point of multipolarity, right? I'm literally thinking in the same terms as them now, is that you have to think of all the poles together, right? You can't just consider, say, oh, that pole's doing well. What about Chinese movements? Well, Iranian movements, Russian movements, Ukrainian movements. You can't just ignore that, right? That's just bad faith analysis. And I think that's another kind of argument I would kind of make too, is that, we need a balance sheet as socialists, as Marxists, right? We can't just bank on the victories that we like and ignore the other ones, right? Because this is the model you're promoting. You're saying that multipolarity, having different poles, somehow strengthens movements throughout the world, right? And empirically speaking, that is not true. What is happening is that you guys are just focusing on the movements and victories you like, right? While ignoring the movements that are struggling, right? That are being crushed, that are inconvenient for your narrative. So that's, I'll end on that point and pass it on to.
One thing I was thinking, just listening to Promise, and I think that is, what he said just made me think about this, that, for the left, this is a strange kind of choice to present it as a choice, to present our choices in terms of international positioning as one of either choosing multipolarity or then being with unipolarity. So, I think that is itself a false, a bad faith way of putting it. Why? I was just thinking about this. Let's see, U.S. imperialism, okay? So whenever America acts imperially in any way, so okay, of course it's to do with invasions, but there are other ways as well. There's the pushing of economic policies. There's all kinds of economic arm twisting, etc., etc. All of that. For instance, in India, if through the WTO or whatever, if you're going to force privatization of education or farm laws of a certain corporate kind, whatever it is, you would support people fighting against that. So you want those who are fighting against American imperialism to win. Now, why, unless you think that these regimes of Russia or China or whatever are basically being attacked by American imperialism and therefore you need them to survive and fight, why on earth would you have any degree of investment in their survival? Okay, Iran included, by the way, because in India, there are sections of the left that will be absolutely silent on Iran or the movement in Iran right now, because basically, what happens if the movement achieves its goals and gets rid of the Islamic Republic? So, that would be regime change. So I think that, the understanding that being with victims of imperialism, and then you have to be with victims of all imperialism, Because then what is Ukraine? Ukraine is a long-term victim, a colonial victim of greater Russian imperialism, and it continues to be today. And that's what it's fighting. So you want them to win. Simple. So for the left, I think the assumption of this kind of choice means that you then relieve yourself of the responsibility to stand, to stand in meaningful solidarity with those struggling. So, with the organization I just parted with, let me give you an example. So what they say is, they're not the obvious kind who say, oh, Putin is wonderful and Ukraine is racist and Nazi or whatever. No. But then what they say is, oh, but Kavita, what other position can we take? We've already said we stand with Ukraine. So I said, but that is a formal position which you're backing with an analysis that says that Russia and Ukraine are bleeding while the war is benefiting America, so the war should end, and so that we want peace. How is peace going to be achieved? Through negotiations. And what are negotiations going to mean? You won't say anything about that, but basically it means Ukraine giving up whole swaths of territory and its people. What happens to its people, right? So that, and what would meaningful solidarity look like? It would look like, what do you do in terms of meaningful solidarity about Palestine, for instance? Because my comrades would also ask, what can we do beyond just, issuing a statement? Well, what do we do in terms of Palestine? We basically campaign to tell people information about what's happening there. And we, we campaign against disinformation, against what is said, in terms of Israeli propaganda and all of that. So, you do that in active terms. So why would you not do that about Ukraine? The whole public sphere, this is not just the left, which is another thing I say that, the left, this isn't an issue just about a debate inside the left. If you look at India, then the entire public sphere is absolutely saturated with Russian propaganda. That is, not just on the far right and the left, but, people who are victims of the far right in India, above all, for instance, the Muslim community. The idea is that America is, killing Muslims. So they don't know that Putin, how many Muslims Putin has killed or displaced or whatever. No clue at all. So, the idea would be that the left has a real job here of countering this misinformation and, filling it with ways in which we can actually help. And one of the big ways is to counter, to do the war, the information war in India on behalf of Ukraine. And one last thing, what we were saying earlier, because I didn't want to lose that thought, was that, what you were saying about this idea of civilizational values. And so, okay, Western civilizational values, and, you can't impose the same standards in Qatar or India or whatever. That also is exactly what these fascist multipolarists are saying right now. That's what they mean by multipolarity, that unipolarity means universal values, and multipolarity means that you can't impose your ideas of equality on us. And in fact, your values of equality are an elite imposition, even in your own country. And so, there are movements against that imposition, which are wonderful movements in your country. And likewise, so that's exactly what worries me, that when the left thinks in these terms, they don't realize that they're saying exactly in what not just the far right in Qatar says, but what the far right across the world says,
This is like when you look at India, the Indian example, one of the RSS's big things has been pushing and promoting the idea that caste is something that is foundational or even fundamental to Indian society. And you would never have a leftist that openly agrees and says, yes, castes are good, we should promote this. But that is in essence what you are saying if you are a leftist that says, oh, we should have a multipolar world, we should support the global south or non-US hegemons against the US. What you are in effect saying, at least in the case of India, is you're saying, I think caste is good and we should have a caste-based society in India. That is that. And for Russia, what you're saying is, I believe that we should kill all LGBT people. For China, you're saying, I believe everyone should be Han and speak Mandarin, and there shouldn't be any dialects or anything. When you look at the actual results, the practical meaning implied by supporting this concept of a multipolar world, it turns out you're just supporting fascism. You're just supporting every single fascist policy that every single fascist regime is trying to impose on their own populations. And from that perspective, it becomes obviously absurd to even imagine that this can somehow be a progressive or a progressive idea or create space for decolonial and socialist movements, because how does promoting fascist policy open space for Marxism? I've never been too clear on that. In the case of Ukraine, actually, and Kavita, this is something I really wanted to bring up, because this is I watched some interviews that Joey sent that you had done previously, talking about Ukraine, and I expressed this to Joey already, but when the war started, journalists and media personalities in Ukraine, we were basically deluged by media crests from India. And in the beginning, we were very happy to do them. Obviously, the war is just starting. We needed to start making sure the Ukrainian narrative has space, that the information space is not immediately dominated completely by Russian propaganda. So we started talking to these Indian media outlets, and we very quickly realized that not only were the Indians, or at least the Indian media that spoke to us, was not interested in interrogating the kind of causes behind this conflict, of critically analyzing why the full-scale invasion occurred and how Ukraine is a victim of imperialist aggression for hundreds of years, but instead it just wanted to have the picture of a Ukrainian and a Russian screaming at each other. And as Ukrainians, we are not, we were not interested in that. We very quickly, there's been basically an unspoken agreement with every single media personality in Ukraine, every single journalist. We don't talk to Indian stations at all. And we see that their information space is just critically repeats Russian propaganda, Russian claims, and without any analysis. And if there is a Ukrainian counterpoint, it's not presented in a way that centers Ukraine as a victim of aggression. It's simply placed as this person disagrees, which brings inequality to this conflict, which does not exist. Russia and Ukraine are not equal subjects in the mysterious war that has just appeared. And that's one of the things I've noticed a lot, and not only in leftist discourse, but primarily in leftist, or at least for me, primarily in leftist spaces, this idea that war descended. It came out of nowhere. There was no war, and then the cloud of war, like a thunderstorm or a hurricane, lowered onto Ukrainian territory. War is not weather. War is not the mysterious reverberations of the aether or anything like that. It is a specific action taken by humans against other humans. And by kind of saying, Ukraine is bleeding, Russia is bleeding. Russia isn't bleeding. Russia attacked. Russia invaded. What do you mean Russia is bleeding? They can stop bleeding by leaving us and not shooting us. Then we don't have a reason to shoot them. It's very simple. And it drives me insane, this way, the way people treat war as some kind of atmospheric disturbance instead of concerted human action. And this applies to quite a number of other things I've noticed in the wider world as well, beyond war. LGBT oppression, religious oppression. These are all very often presented as things that are unavoidable or a consequence of nature instead of human agency. Because people apparently don't have agency. I don't know what, I don't know how these beliefs on the left propagate or how they maintain coherency, because as I've just shown on the slightest analysis, it becomes prima facie absurd.
No, just because what Romeo mentioned about India, I just wanted to quickly come in. First about the television. It's not just you guys. I have stopped, and several others like me have stopped going to Indian mainstream television since 2015. Because yes, this is exactly what you describe as not just about Ukraine and Russia. What they want is someone who is, Muslim and Hindu, Muslim and hateful Hindu, or, somebody who is anti-Modi and someone who is pro-Modi screaming at each other, with the anchor basically sitting in judgment and periodically turning the bad guy silent, which means, and the bad guy is us, basically, silent and, lecturing them. So that's, of course, not new. But the other small thing about caste that you mentioned, that is so central, because I was completely taken aback to see that when I began reading Dugin, I found that Dugin quite centrally, repeatedly says that anti-hierarchy ideology is something we need to dislodge. And in those words, he uses the terms of the caste system of India. He quotes other, like previous fascists like Julius Evola, to say that we are today, the world is in what is called Kali Yuga. And Kali Yuga in Hindu terms means a catastrophic overturning of the correct hierarchies of the good order of society, where the oppressed castes rule, where women are on top, and it's linked because where women are free to marry across castes, where there's a mixing of castes, there's a specific word for that, mixing of castes, like mixing of races. Essentially, that's the catastrophe. And he uses that term. And I kept trying to tell people in India, how can you not be interested in this? How can you not bother that what is part of Indian fascist language is now being incorporated into a global fascist language, the kind that Steve Bannon listens to, the kind that others in between Dugin and Steve Bannon are listening to and using.
Exactly. Thanks for that, Kavita. I kind of have two main points I want us to get into, so we'll see how to get into them. But I'll pin this for now. So what I wanted to say is that you mentioned, I forgot who it was, but I mentioned the word regime change. And I've been finding that very interesting, the discourse around that term, because what is a revolution? Like the Haitian French Revolution were regime changes, like the kind of assumed to be, the Russian Revolution 1917 was a regime change. The Arab Spring's main slogan was the people want the downfall of the regime, Sha'b yurid isqat an-nizam. And this was not meant metaphorically. When I used to engage with these bad faith arguments on the internet, and I try not to anymore, but it was really as if, I don't know how to say this, but when people took down to the streets in Egypt, Tunisia, Bahrain, Syria, Iraq, what have you, and now in Iran more recently, of course, but that's a different context, what they're calling for when they say we want the downfall of the regime, or in Iran, they're literally saying death to the dictator. This is not metaphorical. They're not saying this as a figure of speech. They're saying death to the dictator. They're saying regime change. They're saying the current regime needs to go. When I hear even the hesitancy I've seen, and I think we've all seen it, when Ukrainians say that Putin has to go, he cannot stay. The hesitancy is palpable, right? Or even the silences are quite palpable, because it's almost like if he goes, it's like our worldview cannot be sustained. This is what I'm trying to get at, is that there seems to be this sense of fragility. The current world order already feels fragile. Obviously, you have climate-related fears and anxieties of things just falling apart and catastrophes and whatnot. And it's as if at least part of the story, and this is like a generous reading of it, obviously, because as I said, there are some good faith folks who sort of end up concluding that way without being entirely cognizant, maybe, or like aware of the consequences of what they're saying, essentially. It's almost like we need some stability, right? Like we need things to stop spinning, or we need things to slow down, or whatever. And this ends up kind of feeding, because like, if we think of the Hong Kong protests, right, one thing that has really stopped happening for the most part is Hong Kong being in the news since 2019, after the crushing, obviously. And when Hong Kong was in the news, when Hong Kong was part of quote-unquote the discourse or whatever, you could have all of those debates and whatnot, which largely meant like Hong Kongers being silenced, really. And then when that is all over, well, that's done. And we can stop thinking about it because, well, China has won, or nothing is happening now in Hong Kong. And this idea of nothing is happening because the state has succeeded, or has temporarily succeeded for that matter, is a very dangerous one. And that's why I'm saying that I don't quite understand what makes this even. I know that we use the term left wing, and we use left and leftist and whatnot, because we also need to be kind of discursively coherent, and because we are making like specific differences between that, a leftist saying that and a far-right person saying that, or like a quote-unquote non-political person saying that, are different reasons. But if the conclusions are the same, how, maybe I'm kind of trapping myself here because it's going to be a big question, but it's kind of difficult to tackle it with a one-size-fits-all. And that's why I kind of appreciate this conversation, because we've seen, I think, in our different examples that we've been giving and the experiences that we've had, that the incentives may not be the same, the origins may not be the same, even if the consequences are the same, or even if the final conclusion is the same. And so for us to be able to tackle all of that, we need to sort of recognize it, I guess. And okay, so as I said, I wanted kind of two main points we can get into. A couple of things. One, I'm very interested in hearing your thoughts. What do you see the role of the diasporas in all of this? We've seen, and let me preface that by saying that we've seen the Palestinian diaspora, for example, for the most part, when it is active, of course you have folks who are not active, politically active, when it is active, sort of organizes around the question of Palestine and of the occupation and colonization and apartheid and all of that. And it tends to be very reactive in the sense of when Israel is, launching bombing campaigns or assassinating journalists or all of that, then maybe they take to the streets or maybe they protest and whatnot. So it's reacting to current events, right? The Indian diaspora that I've become familiar with in the UK and the US, a lot of them have sort of gone to the right, and far right, and are BJP nationalists and all of that. We've seen this with Trump's association with the BJP and with the Indian diaspora in the US. How do you sort of reconcile with the role of the diaspora? In my case, I am now part of the diaspora, promise you are as well. Where do you see those dynamics fit in the conversation we've been having?
Yeah, I guess I'll say a bit about the diaspora stuff. Just a very clear reason why Hong Kong Chinese diaspora and Taiwanese diaspora, etc., important. Actually, maybe more Hong Kong and Chinese and Tibetan and Uyghur and other diasporas from that Xinjiang region, quote unquote, is important because people just can't do things, right? We can't organize independently, openly, publicly, really, that much anymore. And Hong Kong's a new new victim of that, right? People are entering a new stage of trying to just understand what it means to be in this new stage where, any little minor protest or dissent you express online or whatever, not even on the streets anymore, right? Could trigger national security laws and stuff like that. So all that means that diaspora is at a very important site for organizing, for rebuilding an oppositional movement, right? And thinking in terms of the left, right? This is actually where, and this is what I always try to explain, and it's really hard to explain, I think, to people, that I think China, especially Chinese government, has very unique experience in terms of silencing independent movements. They've been in a position, right, where they were a rising kind of anti-colonial, worker center movement, and they know exactly what it means to suppress that, right? And I think since Tiananmen, they've become very, very smart in terms of doing that very well with minimal public bloodshed, right? So that they take out very strategically, right, organizers and labor struggles, whatever. Just silence, disappear a couple people. You don't need mass killings like Iran or Russia and things like that. You just need to do just enough so that there is not a movement. And I don't think people understand how effective it has been in doing that. And so the kind of idea of an independent movement-oriented left, right, has really died out for generations, right? But it's contained into very small minorities. People don't even know what it means to be in the left in that sense, right? If you say left in Hong Kong, it's usually people think you mean like the government, right? So it's like there's this like discursively there's like a lot of stuff you have to kind of like dig through, because for people it's just liberalism and communism, which is authoritarianism, and diaspora actually becomes an important space, right, where people, especially from China and from Hong Kong, get exposed to different struggles, right? And one really important example that's kind of brewing is, for example, Chinese international students' participation in the recent strikes, labor strikes in the University of California system, which is, the largest higher ed, I think, strike in U.S. history. What does it mean for, these pool of students to be exposed to new kinds of movement traditions, right? Exposed to new communities of struggle. How does that reshape their own political consciousness? And what can these people bring back? And so I think these are questions I think the diaspora can be thinking about. And this provides the groundwork for us to start thinking about how to, and going back to the problem of action, right? I think what Kavita was saying just now in terms of comrades asking, okay, but what can we do actually about Ukraine or Russia and things like that? People ask the same stuff about China, right? It's like, oh, we can't do anything because xenophobia and U.S.-China tensions. Like, what can you suggest? Like, what can we actually do? To which I actually suggest a bunch of stuff that people like to ignore. But, and some of these things include actually looking at the intersections of national capitals, right? Where does U.S. and Chinese capital intersect? Again, very concrete example. If we dig enough the research, some of the, high-rise, super gentrifying housing development projects in places like Brooklyn and New York are actually bankrolled by loans by Chinese state capital, right? So then I go into a little bit of this, I think, in the Spectre article too. So that's a concrete site of intervention, right? This is where literally Chinese and U.S. capital, developers, Chinese banks, whatever, actually come into contact. And there's nothing abstract or whatever about it, right? This is actually a concrete movement to build people around, right? To energize diaspora communities, which are often not very left-wing, into the left, right? To bridge those struggles with left-wing struggles, with anti-gentrification struggles. And again, another example is like the Chinese international student strike, right? What does it mean to think about, the intersections of these different struggles so that, we can actually, I think the usual response to this is that, well, third campers, anarchists, Trotskyists, whatever, you guys are, saying all these things that, aren't very realistic, right? But I guess what I'm trying to say is, no, in order to actually fight capitalism, right, in its totality, in its many interconnections, we actually do need to look at these interconnections such that neither Washington or Beijing or whatever is not just unrealistic or idealistic. It's actually the most practical way to fight capitalism, right? To fight multipolar imperialism and capitalism, is that we need to link these struggles together. And the truth is, we're always linking struggles together, right? This is just an excuse, right? Whenever we do organizing, right? It's not like, oh, okay, we're only going to talk about race here and not housing. Like, we never do that, right? So why can't we do the same when it comes to different nation states, right? Intersecting together, different capitalist classes intersecting together. And again, I think the diaspora here has a very critical role in terms of bridging all of these things, right? And taking not only new political traditions back home to re-energize things, but to continue the struggle abroad. Because, again, one good thing, quote unquote, about globalization is that now, Chinese state power, for example, right, isn't just contained within the mainland, right? It's about its investments abroad, right? And it's about, the fact that it draws its power from all these different sites abroad. And these are concrete opportunities to put, Chinese diaspora in conversation with indigenous people fighting Chinese, funded agribusinesses in Brazil and the Amazon, right? It's like an explosion of possibilities, right? That aren't abstract, right? It's in fact very highly concrete. And again, we go back to the original point, the diaspora actually becomes the key motor in making, bridging these connections together.
And if I can just take the next slide, because I feel I grew up in kind of both the South Asian diaspora community in the U.S. as well as kind of the post-Soviet or Ukrainian diaspora communities, and a lot of these tendencies I've seen develop throughout my lifetime. Especially, Joey, as you mentioned, how a lot of the Indian diaspora communities are well, we can call them conservative, I suppose, to be polite. At the very least, they push forward candidates that have been endorsed by the BJP. They very often attend temples which are funded by the BJP or RSS. And this is, I think, historically, there has been, of course, the trend of migrant communities becoming more conservative as their status in their new country solidifies, as they gain more social acceptance. They often start ossifying and barring the way to other immigrants, which will necessarily push them right. For the Desi community in particular, what I've seen is these, especially the BJP, and not just the BJP, but there's kind of a whole homegrown industry of, I don't know, Hindu con men, to be very unpolite about it, of these like gurus and spiritual guys who come over and they see money-making opportunities, because one of the biggest things that migrant communities abroad face is that they have homesickness. It's basically you're alienated from your home nation. The food is different. The money is different. Did our power go out? Our power went out.
Oh, can't hear him anymore. Let me text him quickly. My power just went out right now. Yep, that actually happened. Okay. Let's we said at the beginning of the introduction and the episode that this might happen. Let's see what we're going to do. It's okay. I wanted the last point sort of was going to be like there is this argument right on the left of it feels practical at first, even when it's not, which is to say, like, again, it's the whole, we can deal with this later. We can deal with this criticism later. We can deal with this weakness, critique, and whatnot later, after liberation, what that means, whatever that means. And obviously, what we see, and I don't believe in this myself. I'm kind of playing devil's advocate. What do you sort of make about that argument? How do you, in your experiences, have responded? Yeah, like, what do you do with that? Because I wanted to sort of slowly wrap up. But yeah, so what do you do with that argument, Kavita and Promise?
Okay. Still gathering my thoughts, but yeah, I think my response to this, and again, my response to this isn't, very original. I think this has been made by, very many thinkers and movement activists throughout history, and the left too, is that, if the left doesn't take the initiative to critically reflect on our own history, our past and our present, and our mistakes and errors, right, we're going to repeat the same mistakes in the future. And if we genuinely want to transform society, transform reality, right, and build a better world, then we need to actually take ownership, right, and account for those mistakes. Because if we don't do it, the right wing's going to do it, right? And, socialism or barbarism. And this is precisely, and it's about what it means to have know when to draw the line, when movements have turned, all the way into the right for things we shouldn't support. I think the left should be critical and be reflective of when, certain movements or regimes are unsalvageable, right? And that we need to rebuild again. And, about the question of, this is not the time to critique, then there's never a right time to critique, right? Again, the question of China is like, the question of just U.S. versus any country it demonizes, right? It's always going to take advantage of unrests to try to, do regime change or whatever, to stir up things against the regime and promote its own agenda. That risk is always going to be there. And the logical conclusion of the campists' argument is that we don't do anything, is that we have no praxis, right? No plan for revolution, for solidarity. And that to me is completely, right, anti-internationalist, right? And that we actually need to find ways in which to best empower the existing movements that are happening on the ground. Because while people in the Western left are busy, right, sitting there in action, there are existing movements happening, right? Again, there are people already doing stuff on the ground. The goal, the task for the Western left isn't to say, like, to judge whether this is the right timing or not, to support these struggles is to look at how we can support these struggles in the best way possible so as to not, reproduce Western imperialist rhetoric while at the same time empowering these struggles to actually take power, to challenge power on their own right and together with us. And, again, this rhetoric of, now is not the time to critique has historically bred room for disaster among the left, right? This is classic Stalinist tactic, right? It's there's the threat of Western capitalism. We can't talk about our internal errors, right? The logical conclusion of that is that anyone who raises these internal errors, if we don't have a culture of actually healthily talking through them, are going to be cast as, enemies of the state, of capitalist rotors, blah, 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 and, right, excluded, killed, murdered, whatever you call it, right? And we'll be reusing exactly the same mistakes that we've seen in the 20th century. And why would we want to do that as the left, right? Again, going back to the left needs a balance sheet of our failures and mistakes of the past, right? And also our successes, right? And to choose very carefully what we should keep amplifying, extending, and what we should drop and forget and leave, right, in the dustbin of history. And so, I'll just kind of leave it at that.
Well, I think that in India, it has been really hard for me, and I'm still in the process of trying to understand why there was so much hostility, even on the best of the Indian left, to really, take what should have been an intuitively, perfectly normal position of solidarity for, Syria, Ukraine, people's movements, basically, or the one in China now, without, ifs and buts and all kinds of, strange calculations. And tentatively what I would say is that in the first place, I think the barrier, and I don't know how to get around that barrier yet, is on two counts. One is that the left itself is really not comfortable in confronting the history of Ukraine in particular, because that would mean having to confront in specific details the legacy of Stalinism. And while, parts of the left, like the party I was with, will say, oh, we do not defend, Stalin's crimes, or what they call mistakes. But, the idea is that when there's no willingness to discuss which mistakes. What are you calling the mistakes? How big were those mistakes? Who did those mistakes, who were the victims of those mistakes? This is not about, your relationship with Stalin's history or whatever. This is about what happened to people who were harmed by those policies and decisions and crimes, right? Likewise in China now that, the left is going to, and the party I was with, they just carried a long sort of critique of the Chinese Communist Party latest Party Congress document. And it says a lot of things about human rights violations and this and that, all of that. But the point is, what's the conclusion? The concluding sentences, the concluding line is, China is moving away from socialism and is growing into a capitalism. And, there's a sarcastic line about capitalism with Chinese characteristics. What does that mean? It is not about your assessment about how socialist or not socialist it is. That's your problem. What you should be worrying about is what happens to the people who are affected by this regime. How socialist you think or it isn't is really, it's like talking about how many angels on the, can dance on the end of a pin. That is neither here nor there. Where is your assessment of the harm that is done? What can you do to support those people harmed by this regime? So I think, and it's not just inside China, right? If you look at Myanmar, I mean, the fact that China is funding a Myanmar military, it is enabling the Myanmar military, that in India, Islamophobia in India is buoyed up by the fact that you have it in Myanmar, you have it in China. Those who talk about geopolitics, how can you not look at this in terms of geopolitics? That is it a coincidence that you have so many regimes in this neighborhood being actively Islamophobic? Is there no connection between them? Can you find no way of thinking about this beyond your specific national place? I think these are the questions that we need to ask. And the only thing I would think would be helpful would be if there could be this, we are talking here today, but I'm wondering what would happen if you could bring onto the conversation people who are, good faith people. Let's not bring on the really outright bad faith Vijay Prasads and so on, but maybe someone who is, those who are in a more honest place, but are taking these positions and imagining that these are the correct positions. What if we were to bring them into I have failed inside India to bring them inside this conversation. But I think that if there was an attempt on part of, people thinking about this beyond India, to come and say, look, we want to hear from you about your struggles that you are very legitimately waging in India. And then beyond that, we would also like to, speak to you about how you see those struggles in connection with the world. We are reading things you've written. We have some questions about them. And we can have a civil sort of conversation about this, which may move the needle forward a little bit. That's the only thing I can think of which may help to, dislodge this really damaging kind of place in which the left is stuck here. And I say this because, just one last thing, is because in the global south and in India specifically, as I said before, you can't, my Trotskyist friends in other countries say, Stalinist parties. But the point is that these are not obsolete parties. These are parties that are very much leading very important struggles and very genuine struggles that you can support, without, so you have to take them seriously. You can't just write them off as being, outright, policy parties that are so obsolete that they don't count. Which is why I think that, you have to think about how to reach out to them, how to make them think about what they're saying. Yeah. Sorry.
No, thanks a lot for that. I think this is in my view, hopeful note to end this fascinating conversation. So let me ask what I usually ask all guests, which is is there a book that you would recommend to our listeners on any topic that sort of inspires you, that you would like folks to read, and if so, which book is that?
Yeah.
Kavita?
I thought that I would like people to know more about what's happening in India and specifically acquaint themselves with the turn towards majoritarian or far-right fascist Hindu supremacist politics basically in India. So the good book on that, which I would recommend, is one that came out in 2019. It's called The Majoritarian State, and it is edited by Angana Chatterjee, Thomas Blom-Hansen, and Christoph Jaffarlo. So I think that that's a good volume to start with. And the other small thing, not a book, I'll say that if anyone is interested in sort of regular updates and short updates on what's happening in India, please go to www.theindiacable.com. I'm not sure, but it's basically the India Cable. And that's some very good journalists from India who put together these little capsules of stuff, which anyone interested in India can easily read and keep up on.
Yeah, the one book I recommend, which features, I think, prominently in my framework and my Spectre piece about multipolarity is one about money, power, and financial capital in emerging markets by Elias Alami, who is a political economist. I think the book's a good example of this kind of new wave of academic studies, which I think we as organizers can translate more into activists and organizing spaces. Is this new wave of academic studies tracking the new rises and permutations of how state capitalisms work, state capitalism in the plural, right, in different forms, and how the rise of new global financial actors, right, and being a central driver of global capitalism actually doesn't mean that states are becoming less powerful. It's actually looking at how states are becoming more powerful in the sense of helping to regulate and facilitate finance and capital, oppressing labor movements and stuff like that, So the state is getting more powerful. At the same time, new permutations of global finance is also being more powerful. I think, Alami's book's a great example of this kind of developing discourse, which I think is would be useful for, people thinking about international politics and movements of resistance.
All that, I mean, as I said at the beginning of this conversation, there was a risk that Romeo's power would go out. We knew this might be a risk. I'm kind of thankful that he managed to stay along for most of the conversation anyway. But I guess it's a good reminder of in many ways, what we were talking about, like the consequences or the realities are just not the same. And folks who do have power right now should think of the implications for folks like Romeo with their position. So again, all that's left really is for me to thank you too for coming on. This was honestly a fantastic chat, and I'm sure we'll do something again at some point soon. So thanks a lot.
Thank you. It was great meeting everyone here, at least virtually, and absolutely wonderful. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.